At 33,000 feet, silence is heavy. It's a thin, freezing world where humans aren't meant to exist. But on January 26, 1972, that silence didn't just break, it disintegrated. Imagine the floor vanishing beneath your feet in a
Here you are.
heartbeat.
Enjoy
One
your
second,
coffee.
you're serving coffee in a warm, pressurized cabin. The next, you're staring into a sub-zero abyss. There is no warning, no time to scream, just the roar of a jet engine tearing itself apart and the violent, sickening pull of a 6-mile drop. Physics has a set of unbreakable laws for a moment like this. At this altitude, the oxygen is gone. Your lungs should collapse. The cold is so intense it freezes skin in seconds. And then there's gravity, a relentless force pulling you toward the Earth at a terminal velocity of 120 miles per hour. From this height, the ground isn't just soil and stone, it's a concrete wall waiting to erase you from existence. JAT Flight 367 exploded over the Bohemian Mountains, scattering 27 lives into the dark. For 26 of them, the story ended in the clouds. But as the burning debris rained down on the quiet village of Srbská Kamenice, something impossible happened. Amid the twisted metal and the smell of jet fuel, a local villager heard a sound that defied every law of science. A human cry for help. Trapped inside a jagged piece of the tail section, pinned by a mangled catering cart, lay Vesna Vulović. She had just fallen from the cruising altitude of a commercial airliner without a parachute, through the freezing void and onto a jagged mountain slope. She was broken, paralyzed, and covered in blood, but she was breathing. Vesna didn't just survive a crash, she survived a 10-kilometer plunge into the unknown. This isn't just a miracle, it is a mystery that has haunted investigators and scientists for decades. How did a human being survive the unsurvivable? This is the Kanata files. To truly grasp the magnitude of the miracle, you first have to understand the glitch in the universe that put Vesna Vulović on that plane. In the gray, early weeks of 1972, Vesna was a 22-year-old rookie flight attendant for JAT Airways. She was a young woman of her time, vibrant, ambitious, and deeply enamored with the world outside the Iron Curtain. She had joined the airline not just for a career, but for the freedom to fly to London, to buy Western records, and to feel the pulse of a world that felt infinitely larger than her home in Belgrade. But on that fateful Tuesday, January 26th, Vesna wasn't even supposed to be in uniform. According to the airline's official roster, she was scheduled for a completely different route later in the week. However, destiny has a dark sense of humor. A scheduling clerk made a simple clerical error, a mistake that would change the course of aviation history. They confused her with another flight attendant who was also named Vesna. Instead of enjoying her scheduled day off, Vesna Vulović was called to board JAT Flight 367, flying from Copenhagen to Belgrade. She didn't fight the mistake. She didn't complain to her superiors. In her eyes, it was just another chance to see the world. She packed her bags, checked her reflection in the mirror one last time, and stepped out of her door, completely unaware that she was walking into a death trap carefully laid by human hands. The political climate in Europe in 1972 was electric with tension. Beneath the surface of daily life, extremist groups were seeking a stage to broadcast their messages of terror. Unbeknownst to the crew or the passengers boarding in Copenhagen, a briefcase had been slipped into the forward cargo hold. It wasn't filled with travelers' souvenirs or business documents. Inside was a dual-mechanism bomb, a device of cold, silent precision allegedly planted by Croatian nationalists. The takeoff was mundane, almost boring. The Boeing 727 climbed through the heavy winter clouds, eventually leveling off at its cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. This is the edge of the world, a place where the sky turns a deeper shade of blue and the earth below looks like a silent map. Inside the cabin, life was blissfully normal. Vesna moved through the aisles, her mind likely on her next break or the music she'd buy on her next trip. The 23 passengers were settling in. Some were reading, others were drifting into sleep, all completely oblivious to the ticking clock beneath their feet. At precisely 4:01 p.m., as the Boeing 727 soared over the Bohemian mountains of Czechoslovakia, the timer hit 0. The explosion was not just a sound, it was a catastrophic physical transformation. It didn't just punch a hole in the aircraft, it disintegrated the very reality of Flight 367. In a fraction of a second, the pressurized cabin exploded outward with the force of a thunderclap. The sudden decompression at 10,000 meters is a violent, invisible hammer. It rips the air from your lungs and the warmth from your skin. The Boeing 727 snapped like a dry twig. The cockpit was sheared off instantly, sending the pilot spiraling toward the earth in a blind, deadweight fall. The main cabin shattered into thousands of jagged shards of aluminum, glass, and insulation. For 26 of the souls on board, the end was mercifully swift. The vacuum of the atmosphere at that height is so brutal that most were likely unconscious before they even realized the plane was gone. They fell as individuals, tiny, tragic dots, tumbling through a freezing, silent void toward a destination they never chose. But as the world tore itself apart around her, Vesna Vulović was pinned. In a chaotic, 1 in a billion twist of physics, a heavy catering cart slammed into her body, wedging her against the back wall of the tail section. She didn't fall as a person, she fell as a part of the wreckage. As the severed tail began its long, lonely spiral toward the earth, Vesna was locked inside a jagged metal cocoon. She was trapped in the only part of the aircraft that remained intact enough to offer a sliver of protection against the roaring wind and the absolute zero of the high altitude. She was a girl who wasn't supposed to be there, trapped in a nightmare she didn't choose, embarking on a 6-mile descent that no human was ever meant to survive. As the tail section of JAT Flight 367 severed from the main fuselage, it didn't just drop, it entered a realm of chaotic physics. At 33,000 feet, the atmosphere is thin, freezing, and violent. For Vesna Vulović, trapped inside that jagged metal tomb, the next few minutes would be a blur of terror and a masterclass in accidental engineering. To understand how she survived, you have to look at the geometry of the wreckage. In aviation accidents, when a plane disintegrates, the individual pieces don't fall at the same speed. A heavy engine might plummet like a lead weight, but a hollow, aerodynamic section of the tail, it behaves differently. Because it was empty and somewhat cone-shaped, the tail section didn't just fall straight down, it tumbled. It caught the thin mountain air, creating a massive amount of drag. Think of a maple seed or a falling leaf. It oscillates, it spins. In physics, we call this auto-rotation. As the tail section spiraled, the air resistance acted as an invisible brake, potentially shaving vital miles per hour off its terminal velocity. Vesna wasn't falling at the standard 120 miles per hour of a skydiver. She was inside a chaotic, tumbling glider that was fighting gravity every inch of the way. But the air wasn't the only thing fighting for her. Inside that cabin, the catering cart, the very thing that had pinned her, became her shield. In a high-altitude decompression, the biggest threat to a human isn't just the fall, it's the environment. At 10,000 meters, the temperature is -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Your blood can literally begin to form gas bubbles, a lethal condition known as ebullition. But because Vesna was wedged tightly against the back wall, she was shielded from the direct freezing blast of the 500-mile-per-hour wind. The metal skin of the Boeing 727, though torn and screaming, acted as a thermal barrier, keeping her just warm enough to prevent her heart from stopping instantly. Then there is the miracle of the human heart. Most people in a moment of such extreme terror would experience a massive surge in adrenaline, causing their blood pressure to skyrocket. At impact, that pressure often causes the aorta to tear, a burst heart. But Vesna had a secret biological advantage. She had spent years living with chronic low blood pressure. In fact, she had to drink several cups of black coffee just to pass her flight physical. When the plane exploded, her low blood pressure prevented her heart from overexpanding. As the oxygen levels dropped, her body didn't panic, it surrendered. She fell into a deep hypoxic coma. Her brain, in a desperate bid for survival, shut down all non-essential functions, slowing her metabolism to a crawl. She was, for all intents and purposes, in a state of suspended animation while falling through the sky. As the tail section finally cleared the clouds, it didn't find a flat, hard horizon. It found the village of Srbská Kamenice. This is where the physics of the fall met the geography of mercy. The ground below wasn't a solid wall of rock, it was a steep, heavily wooded mountain slope covered in a thick, powdery layer of winter snow. If the tail had hit the ground at 90-degree angle, the G-forces would have been unsurvivable. But it didn't. It hit the slope at an angle, much like a skier landing a jump. The fuselage struck the trees first, snapping pine branches that acted as progressive shock absorbers, draining the kinetic energy of the fall. Finally, it slammed into the deep snow and slid. Instead of a sudden, lethal stop, Vesna experienced a prolonged deceleration. The impact was stretched over several seconds, the difference between a fatal crash and a survivable one. She lay there, buried in the white silence of the Czechoslovakian forest, a broken girl inside a broken machine. Her skull was fractured, her legs were shattered, and 3 of her vertebrae were crushed. By all rights, she should have been dead. But in the quiet after the roar, the miracle was just beginning, because while physics had brought her to the ground, it would take something much more human to keep her alive.
The physics of the fall had done its part, bringing Vesna Vulović to the ground against every conceivable odd. But as the echoes of the crashing metal faded into the frozen silence of the Czechoslovakian forest, a new race began. In medicine, there is a concept known as the golden hour, the critical window of time after a traumatic injury where prompt medical treatment stands the only chance of preventing death. For Vesna, bleeding out in the wreckage of a tail section at the bottom of a wooded ravine, that hour was ticking away in the shadows of the pines. Enter Bruno Hunky. Bruno was a local villager in Srbská Kamenice, a man who had lived through the horrors of World War II. As he heard the terrifying roar of the explosion and the subsequent crash, he didn't run away. He ran toward the smoke. When he reached the debris field, the scene was a nightmare of twisted aluminum and human remains. But amidst the carnage, Bruno heard a sound that chilled him to the bone, a faint, agonizing scream. He found Vesna pinned under the wreckage, her body broken in ways that seemed irreparable. Her skull was fractured, her legs were shattered, and she was hemorrhaging internally. Most people faced with such a sight might have tried to pull her out immediately. In many cases, that would have been a fatal mistake. Moving a victim with multiple spinal fractures without stabilization often severs the spinal cord, causing instant death or permanent total paralysis. But Bruno Hunke was not a typical civilian. During the war, he had served as a German army medic. He understood the delicate geometry of human trauma. He knew that if he moved her even an inch incorrectly, the flicker of life inside her would be extinguished. With the steady hands of a man who had seen too much death, he stabilized her head and neck right there in the snow. He cleared her airway, checked her pulse, and kept her warm using whatever materials he could find. He stayed by her side in the freezing dark, talking to her, keeping her conscious, and refusing to let her slip into the final sleep. When the rescue teams finally arrived, struggling through the steep snow-covered terrain, they found a miracle protected by a veteran. Bruno's split-second medical decisions were the bridge between the mountain and the hospital. Vesna was rushed to a clinic in Prague, entering a state of deep coma that would last for 27 days. The medical reports from those first few hours read like a catalog of a broken machine. 2 broken legs, 3 crushed vertebrae, a crushed pelvis, and several broken ribs. She was paralyzed from the waist down. The doctors were blunt. Even if she woke up, she would likely never walk again. She might not even remember who she was. But Vesna Vulović was a girl who had already cheated gravity. Now she was about to cheat biology. While she lay in that hospital bed, guarded by state security because of the ongoing investigation into the bombing, her body began an agonizingly slow process of reconstruction. It wasn't just the surgeries or the medicine, it was a sheer, stubborn will to exist. Within months, the feeling began to return to her legs. The paralysis that was supposed to be permanent began to recede, inch by painful inch. The woman who fell from the clouds was beginning to stand up. And as she took her first trembling steps, the world began to ask, was this truly just a series of lucky accidents? Or was Vesna Vulović carrying a message about the true limits of human resilience? A message that we are only beginning to understand. But as her body healed, a new shadow began to emerge. In the secretive halls of the Cold War intelligence agencies, a different story was being written. A story that suggested the 33,000-foot fall was a lie, and that the truth was something far more sinister.
The physics of the descent had been a chaotic ballet of metal and air. But as the tail section of JAT Flight 367 finally cleared the low-hanging winter clouds, it faced the ultimate judge, the Earth. For any other passenger on that flight, the ground was a wall of cold, hard finality. But for Vesna Vulović, the geography of a small village called Srbská Kamenice was about to rewrite the laws of terminal impact. In the world of trauma physics, survival is a game of milliseconds and angles. If the tail section had struck a flat field, a body of water, or a concrete road, the kinetic energy would have traveled instantly through the fuselage and into Vesna's spine, liquefying her internal organs in a heartbeat. But the mountain didn't meet her with a flat palm. It met her with a slanted embrace. The wreckage struck a steep, heavily wooded slope. This was the first miracle of the impact. Because of the angle, the tail section didn't come to a dead stop. It hit and slid. Imagine a professional skier landing a massive jump on a downhill transition versus landing on flat ground. By hitting the incline, the force of the fall was redirected from a vertical crush into a horizontal slide. But the slope wasn't bare. It was guarded by a dense forest of pines. As the metal shell tore through the canopy, The trees acted as nature's progressive shock absorbers. Hundreds of branches snapped, each one stealing a fraction of the wreckage's deadly momentum before it finally reached the ground. And there, waiting at the bottom of the trees, was the final layer of mercy, a thick, undisturbed mantle of powdery winter snow. This layer of white acted as a massive crumple zone, stretching the deceleration over those final life-saving inches. The roar of the crash was replaced by a terrifying, ringing silence. The tail section lay mangled in a ravine, a tomb of white and gray. Vesna was still pinned inside, her body a map of catastrophic trauma. Her skull was fractured, her legs were shattered, and 3 of her vertebrae were crushed. She was hemorrhaging, her life leaking into the frozen soil of Czechoslovakia. This is where the story shifts from the miraculous to the heroic. The first person to reach the smoking debris wasn't a rescue team or a soldier, it was a local villager named Bruno Honke. In the history of survival, Bruno is the silent titan. As he climbed through the snow toward the wreckage, he heard a sound that should have been impossible among the dead, a faint, guttural cry for help. When he found Vesna, she was a vision of horror. Most untrained rescuers, driven by adrenaline and panic, would have tried to pull her from the metal immediately. In the world of spinal injuries, that move is often a death sentence. Moving a victim with shattered vertebrae without stabilization can sever the spinal cord, causing instant death or permanent total paralysis. But Bruno Honke had a secret. During World War II, he had served as a medic in the German army. He had spent years in the mud and blood of the front lines, learning the grim art of battlefield triage. He looked at Vesna and didn't see a victim to be pulled. He saw a fragile puzzle to be stabilized. With steady, weathered hands, Bruno cleared the debris from her face so she could breathe. He refused to move her body, knowing the jagged bone fragments near her spine were millimeters away from ending her life. He stayed with her in the biting cold, wrapping her in whatever warmth he could find, talking to her in the darkness to keep her from slipping into a permanent coma. He became her human anchor to the world of the living. By the time the official rescue team struggled up the mountain, Bruno had already done the impossible. He had kept her heart beating through the golden hour. He had protected her shattered spine with the precision of a surgeon in the middle of a forest. As they carried her away on a stretcher, Bruno stood in the snow, watching the girl who fell from the sky disappear into the mist. Physics gave her a chance. The snow gave her a cushion, but it was the hands of an old medic that gave her a future. The girl was alive, but the battle for her soul and the truth of what really happened at 33,000 feet was only just beginning.
Survival is often depicted as a single explosive moment of triumph. But for Vesna Vulović, the true survival began in a sterile hospital bed in Prague, surrounded by the hum of machines and the watchful eyes of state security. When she finally opened her eyes after 27 days of darkness, her first words weren't about the crash or the cold. She looked at the doctors, confused by the casts covering her broken body, and simply asked for a cigarette. The brain, in an act of supreme mercy, had erased the 10,160-meter drop from her conscious mind. She had no memory of the bomb, the freezing void, and the terrifying 6-mile plunge. To Vesna, she had simply fallen asleep in a warm cabin in Copenhagen and woken up in a nightmare of shattered bone and white sheets. The medical prognosis was devastating. Her skull was fractured in multiple places, both of her legs were crushed, and 3 of her vertebrae were obliterated, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. In 1972, the chances of walking away from such injuries were near zero. Most experts believed she would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair, a silent monument to a tragedy she couldn't even remember.
But Vesna's body seemed to operate on a different set of rules. Slowly, against every neurological chart in the hospital, the nerves began to fire. The muscles began to twitch. Within 10 months, she defied the experts and stood up. Within a year, she was walking. She didn't just return to health, she returned to the sky. While most survivors would have been paralyzed by the mere sight of an airport, Vesna had no fear of flying. She would say later, "I don't remember the crash, so why should I be afraid of it?" She even attempted to return to her job as a flight attendant. However, JAT Airways, fearing the morbid publicity of having the girl who fell on their active routes, reassigned her to a desk job in the freight department. For the next 20 years, Vesna lived as a national hero in Yugoslavia, but she was more than just a survivor of a plane crash. In the 1990s, when her country began to tear itself apart under the regime of Slobodan Milosevic, Vesna found a new kind of courage. She used her legendary status to lead protests and fight for democracy. The woman who had survived a terrorist bomb at 33,000 feet was now standing at the front lines of a revolution, refusing to be silenced by a dictator. She had conquered gravity. She was not about to be conquered by a regime. As she aged, the world began to look back at her story with a more critical eye. In 2009, a team of investigative journalists released a bombshell report claiming the plane hadn't exploded at 33,000 feet, but was accidentally shot down by the Czechoslovakian military at a much lower altitude, roughly 800 meters. If true, it moved the story from physically impossible to statistically improbable. Yet the Serbian government and the Guinness World Records stood by the original data. Vesna herself, caught between a miracle she couldn't remember and a controversy she didn't want, remained a figure of quiet dignity. She lived out her final years in a small apartment in Belgrade, surrounded by her cats, often wondering why she was the one chosen to remain when 26 others were taken. Vesna passed away in December 2016, alone in her home at the age of 66. When the world heard the news, they were reminded once again of the girl who fell from the clouds. What is the legacy of Vesna Vulović? Is it a record in a book, a miracle of physics, or is it something more profound? Her story reminds us that the human frame is both incredibly fragile and impossibly strong. We are held together by biology, but we are driven by something science cannot yet measure. Whether it was the angle of the slope, the depth of the snow, or the stubbornness of a low-pressure heart, Vesna Vulović proved that the end is only the end if you accept it. She was the girl who fell into history and walked away to tell us that even when gravity demands your life, the soul has its own way of staying aloft. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the impossible. This has been the Kanata Files. If you believe there are some things science just can't explain, let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.